Glad, everybody wants to be younger. Say, wait a minute, there's not that much time left and all, but we all, if we're lucky, get older. I am so glad I'm where I am today because if I were younger, I couldn't ever have that kind of a platform. I spent most of my life trying to make people laugh. Sometimes it worked beautifully. Sometimes a joke landed with all the grace of a piano falling down a staircase, but after enough years in this business, you stop remembering every rating, every review, every applause line. You remember the people. And one question has stayed with me more than most. After all these years, who were the 5 people I loved and admired the most? Well, that is almost an impossible question, because loved can mean a lot of things. Some people became dear friends. Some taught me lessons without ever sitting me down and calling them lessons. Some could make me laugh when there wasn't an audience anywhere near us. And some meant something to me long before I ever imagined I might meet them. When I was younger, I worried about getting the next job, getting the laugh, keeping the show moving, and remembering where I was supposed to stand. Now, I think about rehearsals, dressing rooms, those conversations after everyone else had gone home. That's where you really get to know somebody. And when I think about the people who meant the most to me, 5 names keep coming back. The first one has to be Lucy. Lucille Ball was already a legend by the time I really got to know her. Everybody knew Lucy Ricardo. Everybody knew that red hair, that face, that timing. She could take something completely ordinary and somehow turn it into beautiful chaos. But the Lucy I remember most wasn't the woman on television. She was the woman who came backstage to see me when I was doing Once Upon a Mattress. I was still pretty new then, certainly nowhere near her level. Lucy didn't have to come back and introduce herself. She didn't have to spend time talking to me, but she did. And before she left, she told me something very simple. If I ever needed her for anything, give her a call. Now, when somebody as famous as Lucille Ball tells you that, part of you thinks, well, isn't that nice? You don't necessarily believe you're actually supposed to call, but I did. I was going to do a television special and I needed somebody wonderful, so I worked up the nerve and asked Lucy if she would do it with me. And she said yes. That told me almost everything I needed to know about her. Lucy understood what it meant when somebody gave you a chance. She knew how hard this business could be, especially for women who wanted to be more than decoration while somebody else got the laugh. She had fought for her own place, but once she had it, she didn't pull the ladder up behind her. That generosity stayed with me. And she was funny off camera too, not performing funny. Lucy could be wonderfully blunt. There was nothing delicate about her when she had an opinion, and believe me, she usually had one. I loved that about her. As the years went by, our friendship continued. Every birthday, Lucy would send me flowers. It became one of those little traditions you almost start taking for granted because you assume it will always be there. Then came my birthday in 1989. Lucy died that day, and later flowers arrived. She had arranged them before she died. I can still think about that and feel the strange combination of heartbreak and gratitude that came with it. Here was this woman who had meant so much to me, gone suddenly, and yet one last gesture from her was already on its way. That's Lucy to me. The world remembers one of the greatest comedy stars television ever produced. I remember the woman who showed up backstage for a young performer, kept her word, became my friend, and never stopped being generous. She used to call me kid. Coming from Lucy, I was perfectly happy to stay a kid forever. Now, Julie Andrews is different. Julie wasn't someone I admired from a distance for very long. She became family to me. Of course, the world knows Julie for that voice, that extraordinary voice. She could sing one note and make the rest of us wonder why we had bothered opening our mouths in the first place. And then there was me. I could sing, I could carry a tune, but standing next to Julie Andrews could make you feel as though you had wandered into the wrong rehearsal. That difference between us became part of the fun. Julie had this elegance about her. She was precise, graceful, completely in control. I was usually trying to find out how far I could fall without hurting myself. Somehow, it worked. When we did Julie and Carol at Carnegie Hall, people saw two performers who seemed very different. Julie had that beautiful musical discipline. I had my comedy instincts, my faces, my physical silliness. But what made it work wasn't the contrast. It was the trust. Julie never made you feel that she needed to protect herself from looking foolish. That's rare, especially when someone is already known for being elegant and sophisticated. She was willing to play, and if you're doing comedy with somebody, that matters more than people realize. You have to trust that the other person won't leave you hanging. You have to know that if something goes wrong, they'll stay with you. Sometimes the funniest moments come from exactly that. Julie understood it. And off stage, she had this warmth that people didn't always see because they were so busy admiring the perfection. That's the funny thing about knowing someone famous. The public sees the finished product. They see the entrance, the song, the applause. You see the person waiting in the wings. You see whether they're kind when nobody is watching. You see whether they make the people around them feel comfortable. Julie did. Our friendship lasted because it was never based only on work. We could go long periods without doing anything together and still pick up that connection again. That's something I came to value more and more as I got older. Show business gives you plenty of acquaintances. It gives you people who love you when the show is a hit. Real friendship is something else. Julie gave me that. And I suppose what I loved most was that underneath all that talent and all that polish, she was still willing to be silly with me. That's a very precious quality, especially when the person being silly with you happens to be Julie Andrews. Then there was Harvey Korman. Harvey was one of those people who made everybody around him better. The audience knew him for the faces, the voices, the characters, and those wonderful moments when he was trying desperately not to laugh. I knew the man standing beside me before the sketch started. Harvey took comedy seriously, but he never treated it selfishly. That mattered to me. On a variety show, everybody has to give something up once in a while. You may have a funny line, but maybe somebody else can make it funnier. You may have a big moment, but sometimes the scene works better if you step back. Harvey understood that. If he thought a line would get a bigger laugh coming from someone else, he could let it go. That sounds simple. It isn't. Performers are human. We like laughs. We like applause. We like hearing that little explosion from the audience and knowing it belonged to us. Harvey cared more about the sketch. That made him invaluable. And then, of course, we brought Tim Conway into the equation. Poor Harvey. Tim discovered very quickly that Harvey was breakable. Once Tim knew he could make Harvey lose control, you could almost see that little light go on in his eyes. Tim would change a pause, add some tiny movement, stretch a moment just a little longer than he had in rehearsal. Harvey would try to hold on. He would look away, his mouth would tighten, his shoulders would start moving, and then he was gone. Now, people watching at home loved those moments because they felt spontaneous, and they were. But what people sometimes forget is how good Harvey had to be for those moments to work. He could play a ridiculous character completely straight. That was his gift. He never begged the audience to laugh. He trusted the material. He trusted the other performers. And because he played everything with such commitment, when the whole thing finally cracked apart, it became even funnier. I loved working with him because I always felt safe with Harvey. Comedy can become chaotic very quickly, especially on our show. Costumes failed, lines changed, people broke character, Something unexpected would happen in front of a live audience and suddenly you had to figure out what to do. With Harvey, you knew he would be there. He listened, he reacted, he gave you something to play against. And when a scene needed somebody else to shine, he could let them. That kind of generosity is easy to overlook because it doesn't always show up in the credits. But I noticed it. I think we all did. People remember Harvey Korman laughing helplessly while Tim Conway tortured him. I remember something quieter. I remember a wonderful actor who understood that comedy was a team sport. And when I think about Harvey now, that's what I miss most. Not just how funny he was, how much funnier he allowed all of us to be. And if I'm talking about Harvey, sooner or later I have to talk about Tim Conway. Tim had one of the most dangerous qualities a comedian can have: patience. He never seemed to be in a hurry to get the laugh. That was what made him so deadly. Most comedians, if we're being honest, want to get there. We feel the audience waiting and we want to give them something. Tim could wait. He could let a silence sit there until everybody became uncomfortable. Then he would move one finger, change his expression, say one quiet little line, and suddenly the whole room was gone. That was Tim. People remember the oldest man. They remember the dentist sketch. They remember Harvey trying not to laugh and failing completely. I remember watching Tim before those moments happened. He always looked so innocent. That should have frightened us more than it did. During rehearsal, Tim might do something one way. Then when we were actually taping in front of the audience, he could add something, a pause, a look, a line we weren't expecting. And once you realized he had changed something, it was usually too late. You were finished. Harvey was his favorite victim, of course. Tim knew exactly how to get him. He didn't have to attack him with jokes. He would simply stretch a moment until Harvey couldn't stand it anymore. I wasn't immune either. There were times when my entire job became trying to keep my face under control. And that is a terrible position to be in when you're supposed to be running the show. The wonderful thing about Tim was that none of it felt mean. He wasn't trying to embarrass you. He was playing with you. That's an important difference. Comedy can become competitive. People count laughs. They notice who got the biggest response. They worry about who has the best line. Tim didn't feel like that to me. He just loved finding the funny thing. Sometimes the funny thing was in the script. Sometimes it was something nobody had planned. And sometimes it was Harvey Korman desperately staring at the floor because looking at Tim would end the scene. Tim also reminded me that perfection is not always what makes television memorable. Some of the moments people still talk about happened because things didn't go exactly as planned. Somebody cracked up. Somebody had to recover. A scene went somewhere we hadn't expected. And Tim was usually somewhere in the middle of it, looking as though he had absolutely nothing to do with the trouble. I loved him for that. He brought play into the room. Real play. The kind you have when you forget about the cameras for a moment and simply enjoy making another person laugh. There are performers you admire because they are disciplined. There are performers you admire because they are brilliant. Tim was both, but what I remember most is how much joy he seemed to find in making the rest of us completely helpless. And believe me, he was very, very good at it. The last person may surprise you a little because he wasn't really a comedian. Jimmy Stewart. I had admired Jimmy long before I ever knew him, long before television shows and rehearsals and all the wonderful craziness that came later. I was just a kid watching movies and thinking Jimmy Stewart was something special. He didn't seem like a movie star in the usual sense. There was something about him that felt ordinary, and I mean that as the highest compliment. He could play a man who was nervous, awkward, decent, stubborn, frightened, hopeful, sometimes all in the same scene, and you believed him. That stayed with me. Years later, when I actually got the chance to know him, I discovered something that doesn't always happen in this business. The person was just as wonderful as the image, maybe even more so. Jimmy was kind. He was modest. He had that familiar way of speaking everybody recognized, but in person there was no sense that he was performing Jimmy Stewart for you. He didn't need to remind anybody who he was. Everybody already knew. And I think that was part of what made him so impressive to me. You meet a lot of famous people when you've been around long enough. Some of them enter a room and you can almost feel the room being told they have arrived. Jimmy wasn't like that. He had presence without demanding attention. That is very rare. I had spent so many years looking up to him that I suppose part of me was a little afraid to meet the real man. You know, sometimes it is safer to leave your heroes up there on the screen, because what if they disappoint you? Jimmy didn't. If anything, knowing him made me admire him more. He appeared on our show, and I still had that strange little feeling of watching someone I had admired when I was young suddenly standing there in front of me. Only now I was supposed to act normal. I'm not sure I ever completely managed that, and what I loved was that he made it easy. There was no grand movie star behavior, no need to impress anyone. Just a professional, gracious man who had been through an extraordinary career and somehow kept his feet on the ground. That taught me something. Talent is wonderful. Success is wonderful. But the way you carry those things matters. Jimmy had every reason in the world to think of himself as important. Instead, he made other people feel important. That is a much harder trick. The public remembers the films, the voice, the characters, all those unforgettable performances. I remember the feeling of discovering that somebody I had admired from far away was exactly the kind of person I hoped he would be. When that happens, you don't stop being a fan. You just become a very grateful one. When I think about Lucy, I think about generosity. She reached back and helped someone who was still trying to find her place. When I think about Julie, I think about friendship, the kind that survives long after the curtain comes down. Harvey makes me think about trust. He understood that the funniest person in a scene didn't always have to be him. Tim reminds me of pure joy, that wonderful feeling when a sketch stopped being work and everybody was simply trying not to laugh. And Jimmy reminds me that sometimes your heroes really can be as good as you hope they were. I've been very lucky. I got to work with extraordinary people. I got to stand beside them, laugh with them, learn from them, and occasionally forget my own lines because one of them was being far too funny. The shows eventually end, the costumes get packed away, the applause disappears faster than you think, but people stay with you. Their voices do, their kindness does, the way they made you feel does. And after all these years, those are the things I treasure most. Not the trophies, not the ratings, just the people. And fortunately for me, I knew some very funny ones